In the panel, we'll have a few minutes to ask questions and relate to some of the issues. We can understand why you received so many prizes, and I saw the list and I couldn't even mention it. I'm happy that the Dan David Prize will be from now on part of this list. You mentioned Professor Sir Anthony Atkinson. He had to be with us today. Unfortunately, he couldn't come because of health problem, and we do send him from here our wishes for a quick recovery. I'd like to relate, ironically, to two issues regarding measurement, and I live in Rishon LeZion, fourth biggest city in Israel, 20 kilometers from here. And you know that we all pay taxes due to the how big our apartment houses land are. And my municipality wants very much to show that we decrease the tax we pay. So about a year ago, they decided to remeasure the houses and apartments. So actually the tax reduced. In most of the cities, it increased, but in my city, it decreased. But suddenly, my house became bigger. My house is 25 years old. Nothing changed there. But suddenly, they measure it differently. So I have a bigger house now because what they did measure then, they measured now. So I have to pay more taxes without being said that they increased tax. Another example I'd like to give is that my parents has an antique mirror in the entrance to their house. I love this mirror. When I stand in front of it, I'm tall and thin. So I'd like to stay there all the time. The only problem is that I'm the only one that can see it, and in the eye of my mind, I see myself thin and tall in that mirror, but the other people see me as I am not in front of the mirror. So I think the issue of how we measure is very important issue. I come from the School of Social Work, and lots of session debate and argument relate to the issue of what is poverty, how we measure it, what is important, and we'll come back to it later on. I would like to invite now Professor Tzvi Eckstein. Professor Eckstein is an emeritus professor from our Berglas, Eitan Berglas School of Economy. He is now in Herzliya in IDC. And Professor Eckstein will share his idea about poverty in Israel. We heard a lot about measurement and poverty around the globes, and now we'll hear about sources and policy in Israel. Professor, let's get out here. And you'll be amazed how time we can do this.
Okay. Let me just first thank the Dan David Prize and also the family for the important prize, but also for the committee for choosing this important topic of poverty as a central for present challenges of economic societies worldwide, and Israel in particular. I want to thank also the committee for selecting leading worldwide economist, Professor Anthony Atkins, Professor Françoise Bourguignon, and Jim Heckman, who have contributed a lot to our understanding of policies and theories on issues of poverty and inequality. And thank you a lot for inviting me. And I will be very brief. I base my presentation on a joint work with Tali Larome, and we'll do it at the institute at IDC that focus on policy. And I am going not to mention all the references, but a lot you will see coming related to what you have just presented by Françoise Bourguignon and a lot of work by Professor Ekman and others. Let me start, and the presentation before helps me a lot on starting by saying that we are the highest poverty rate among developed countries, so basically OECD countries, and the measurement is what I call poverty rate. And I want to emphasize this is rather than a poverty line, we're talking about poverty rate, which is, has been mentioned, is 1/2 of the median, which is less influence from the top earning, but it's still influenced by the location of the median. And as has been mentioned before, if the median goes down, the poverty line goes down. So the question you have to be very careful when you analyze the sources. We are 18.8 in 2004, second after Mexico. Let's just give you the outline. So my main point of the source is very simple. It's the labor market. I will show you that. I want to emphasize that unfortunately the research in Israel on those issues is not on the same standard of general academic research on that. What I base here are the 3 sources that are accepted, I think, now by researchers over the last 25 years at least, maybe more, on the sources for the inequality within the leading OECD countries. A lot of the work, most of the work is about the US, which is also leading in the poverty line and inequality. There are 3 sources. I will mention this and explain it more, is what is called the skill bias technical change. The second one is globalization and free trade, and in Israel in particular what I call dual market. And then I will mention the weak compliance with labor market production. What I will say that Israel has another feature which is emphasized also by the OECD report, and I refer to the OECD 2011 initial report, which is called Unequal We Stand, and they do a very large comparison across OECD countries. And Israel is unique also in among OECD countries, we are exceptional on population growth. Israel has been growing between 1.8 to 2% in the last few years, and all OECD countries growing much less. US growing now by 0.5%, and very unequal. And I will mention how that is very much related and unique to the poverty line in Israel, and that's related to the issue of the family in the intra-house Professor Françoise mentioned. And the last thing I want to say that Israel has done some interesting and successive policies in active labor market policies, which Professor Ekman has been studied, for a long, long time, at least since I started reading his work. I follow that very much, and especially on low skill. And focusing on poverty is important about inequality because it focuses on issues of enhancing employment, enhancing human capital, and enhancing productivity of where the low income are working. And I will mention at the end what can be done more, and that will be the conclusion of my presentation. Poverty, since I realized that I'm the first, so I give you the line of poverty in Israel. You see the blue line very clearly. It has been growing quite substantially, and especially the main growth happened in Israel, and it depends how you measure it, but in between the mid-90s to 2006, that's where the poverty line went up, and since then it's a bit flat. And I want to emphasize that then it has been going down, and I will mention why in terms of the sources. It's much higher. It's still higher than the US and higher than the OECD, but this positive line in the US and the OECD is the issues of the increasing inequality that attract a lot of research worldwide. If you go to another relative, which is the Gini index, so I just want to emphasize measurement of poverty is different, and relative, still we are in the relative measures of poverty are different. So if you go to the Gini coefficient, even in Israel, you see a stronger reduction recently, in the US stronger increase recently, and really to go into the details of the reasons I think is extremely important. So here is, I think, a key figure that comes from the comparison and I think the story of, I would say, from 85 to today. And basically, that's the period that most countries are realizing this increase in inequality. And what you see here is that most of the increase in inequality comes from the fact that the top 10, if you want the top 10, 20%, the 10 decile and the 9 decile are growing much faster in their net income. This is net household income. So let me say something about the net household income. The way we measure it worldwide is basically net income per household, and the household is actually standardized by the standard rating on size of the household. And the size of the household measure, you give it 0.85 and so forth, so there is a kind of an increasing return by the family size. And that's, I think, is a key story, is really that a lot has to do with the poverty, is that the lower deciles are growing much lower. Look, it's still growing, 1.7, and we still growing in inequality. So it actually does not reflect at all any absolute measure of poverty. It's fully a measure of inequality, and it is heavily emphasized from the fact that we have, even with the poverty, that we have the top deciles, even that we're just looking for half of the median. That's the net income. The other part is the labor income. And you can see that actually the labor income, it is that the lower deciles are growing even lower, but the fact that, and the difference, as you can see in the levels overall, and the jump that occur here, and what you see, the jump in the labor income inequality occur in Israel earlier. It occurred mainly in the 90s, in the mid-90s. So the labor income inequality actually precedes the growth in the inequality that we see in the net household income. Of course, there are issues of taxes, etc., but I want to emphasize that really the inequality coming from the labor market, I think it's accepted, is going on in Israel, and it's really the growth rate which is much lower on the lower decile than the higher deciles. And I think if you look at the average, by the way, and you compare it to the OECD countries, on average we are growing as much as the OECD countries. We used to grow, and I mean about just below 2%. And that's actually also the GDP growth, or in this respect, we behave very much like the others. So here are the main stories. So let me just make a few comments about it. Skill bias technical change. Skill bias technical change is an hypothesis that has been shown to exist in most OECD, or almost not all, but most OECD countries, is basically that the high-skilled workers enjoyed larger increase in productivity, larger increase in demand, and larger income and higher return. That's the skill bias technical change. The globalization is the fact that I think has been said. It's basically in the late 80s and the 90s. The two things that happen is that we have a join of China and India and Asia and other countries join the labor market, and trade has increased substantially, and I will say about Israel, and basically a much larger labor supply of poor people and poor countries enter to the market and influence the salaries of and the low growth of the low deciles and the low labor skill in each country. And the third aspect, which is worldwide, it's not Israel, it's all countries. It's Sweden, it's US, England, and Israel. And the last thing that has been mentioned a lot in the research is the weak regulation and enforcement of effective labor market protection, and also decrease in the minimum wage and the enforcement of the minimum wage. And basically how much low workers are protected against discrimination. I'm not talking about whether they are protected and causing inefficiency, really in terms of actually causing discrimination and in this sense. And there is an issue, still a debate among economists about the importance of the minimum wage. But I think once you have a minimum wage, the question is whether you comply with it among the low wage workers. And in all three sources, and I will show you facts, Israel is exceptional in a very unique way. If we look at hourly wage, I think we are not exceptional, but we are like the others. If you look at the hourly wage, both female and male, there is a huge increase on the hourly wage of the 16 and a half years of schooling. There is a small increase for the low one, and there is no increase and zero rate increase on the very low schooling levels. And this is true for male and female, and the difference is high, and the return to education relative to others is similar, a little higher from estimates in Israel for the hourly wage. But income is the wage multiply employment. And we know that the same thing happened in employment. So in Israel, it's quite unique. I don't know if unique, but it's quite amazing that in the 90s, as you can see, the employment rate of people below 10 degrees is going down. Also, the employment of up to high school is flat among men. For female, it's a little going up, but it's extremely low. It's much higher and increasing among. What we see, which I want to emphasize, the big success of the Israeli government policies is those positive slopes in the last 10 years. Israel is among the OECD succeed to increase the total employment rate in the country about 8 percentage points for prime age 25 to 65 in the last 12 years. And it basically, we were in a gap of about 8% relative to, I would say, the leading employment rates in the 8 to 10% relative to the US, and we were now above US employment rates, and we were 10% below, and we are very close now to employment rates across men and average women, not among Arabic women, but overall, we are really getting in a very high employment rate, and this, you see this change that has occurred in Israel in the last 10 years, and it was not independent of government policy. So that was about the source of the labor market. That's what I showed you before. Employment is much lower and among low-skilled and etc. So the key, I want to emphasize the globalization and trade. One number I don't give you is that actually Israel opened up trade significantly in the beginning of the 90s. And that has made a huge change on all the industrial production and the import of goods. It's not fully free trade, but it is a lot of free trade. And I don't have the numbers, and I want to save the numbers, but everyone who knows about Israel, that has an impact, especially on the industrial workers. Industrial workers has been going down dramatically at that period. But in addition, unlike almost any OECD countries, we allow a huge flow of workers from Asia to join Israel. The dark line, which we call foreign, is the percentage which you measure here of the people in the labor force who came from Asia to work in Israel. This is from the total employment in the business sector, in the economy. If you take it from the low skills, and they are all low skills, construction, agriculture, and taking care of the elderly, this has been unparalleled. And recently we get also people from Africa, and together there are more. And we always had also the Palestinians who are working here, and I want to emphasize, Palestinian Authority GDP per capita is less than China, is less, it's about $3,000, $4,000, and the income there is much, much lower. And all of them, which is reaching 12%, which is about 40% of the low-skilled workers, push the wages down. And the other one is the high-tech. We want everybody to be in high-tech, we want everyone to do mathematics, but I want to emphasize we are the highest. We have 8.5% of the workforce in the labor force. And basically, we had a policy where the low skills in Israel compete heavily and directly, not only on traded good, but also on non-traded good with the Asian workers, which come here. And we have the high-tech sector compete heavily with the Silicon Valley. No OECD countries actually actively run this kind of policies. The last thing I want to say, I have only 5 minutes, so I want to say something positive as well. I want to emphasize the compliance with minimum wage. You can see the minimum wage as a percentage of the minimum wage relative to the average wage has been growing, so minimum wage has been growing up significantly. Most of the period, beside the recent period, also the percentage of people actually not comply with the minimum wage increased almost at the same rate. And if you look at this, it's basically non-compliance in the sectors which are very low wage, of course, and you can see how much it is. It's huge. And the non-compliance is also with the population which is not compliance, and there are problems, and I will mention this, is really the Arab and the others, the Arab and the ultra-Orthodox. I want to show you a graph from the OECD countries in terms of household size and poverty. Israel is here. Next to us is Turkey and Mexico. US is here. We have an average family of 3.3, where the average in the OECD is 2.5. That's a huge difference, and that's influenced the level of poverty quite significantly, because most of the largest families are among the poor. They choose it, and I think it's a great idea to have a lot of population, and you can see the numbers. The household size among the Arabs is 4.6, and about 50% of them are below the existing poverty line, etc. And you can see that, but still there are a lot of single parents, and still the others are 2.9 on average. So this is 2.9 is much higher than 2.5. All the Israeli people have more children than OECD countries in a significant way. It's good. I think children is the future. It's important, but it also should be reflected in understanding the sources of poverty and where we should put the money to change the things. And therefore, I want to emphasize, Arab and ultra-Orthodox are most affected from all the aspects. And one of the key aspects is where you invest more in the education. Do you invest more in the education on 5 units in mathematics, or you invest more in the education in the low skill? We come with families that have problems that are under possibility of not doing well. That's related to a lot of the issues that probably Professor Ekman will tell us later on, and I learned from his research. Let me just emphasize a list. I take 3 minutes to give you a list of policies. Each of these policies could take 20 minutes just to think about, and it will take months to build it up. And I want to emphasize, Israel has done on employment and experience. I want to emphasize, when you put people to work, then they gain experience. The rate of return on experience is at least 2/3 of the rate of return on a year of schooling. About, on average, on our estimates. We have done significantly, but mainly from cutting down welfare and other sources of income and other aspects. We pushed them into the labor market because we cut those from 2003 on. Welfare to work program. We are among the only OECD country that doesn't have a full welfare to work program. Welfare to work program should be mandatory, should be to all welfare recipients that have employment test, voluntary for others, and we don't have any program for the disabled. We are among the only OECD countries that doesn't have an employment active labor market policies based on the success of those in the US, in England, in Australia, in Switzerland, etc., that we can do. We introduced 10 years ago, a little less, 8 years ago, earned income tax credit, negative tax credit. It's successful. It's retained poor people into work. We should increase it. It is actually an important policy tool, very successful so far in Israel. Measurements are good. We should eliminate almost non-Israeli workers' permits in most places. We actually should reduce the amount of globalization and on the non-traded sector, on the services sector, which is really the key sector that absorbs most of these workers. We should support services. I think childcare facilities enable female to go to work, enable the Arab population female to go to work more, and public transportation. We have a very weak public transportation. In most OECD countries, the poor living in the suburbs of the main urban sectors are poor, a lot of them living far away with no transportation, and if there is a transportation, it's extremely expensive. But that's not enough. To make them to work, it's not enough. Human capital is of the lower 50%. Investment of this, of the public, is under any levels of OECD countries, not to talk about the successful in Switzerland and Germany and even the US. We really have to develop, I think this is something we are working on a program that will make technical and college education basically to people who are not going to academic. We have the highest rate of people going to academic education, 50% in OECD countries, but we have basically no public policy on extra education after high school to those who are going to other occupations, like community college, like technical colleges, and that is, I think, the key issue of human capital that we should do, beside the other that I mentioned. We have a huge, unlike any other OECD countries, we are giving corporate tax reduction only to basically high-tech sector. Why? Because many reasons. But one reason is certainly it caused inequality to increase. It really make the investment into those sectors higher, and probably we should equalize it across all. And if we need to have a low corporate rate for the high-tech, we probably should need also low rate for construction and for the services sector. It's important. We should have R&D. We have only R&D to the high-tech. It's great, it's important, but we should enlarge and have, we are really low in any R&D activities in the services and the traditional industries. We have minimum wage compliance and other effective labor market compliance. We should make it in all sectors. This has been done partially, can be done significantly more, especially in the services sector, in the Arab and the ultra-Orthodox neighborhood. The government has done almost nothing about this, and that should be imposed now. Thank you.